The elegant dinner exploded when the true villain, Miles Carraway, pointed a finger across the silver and publicly screamed the truth. She is not a noblewoman. She is the common clerk who forged your signature. Her desperate confession was cut short when the Duke stepped in, not to condemn her, but to declare, "I knew everything. Now the lie is dead, the revenge plot is ruined, and she is trapped, forced to accept a new, honest contract with the powerful man who has all the evidence, and who just saved her life." What does the Duke truly want from the woman who nearly ruined his entire empire? If you're ready to enjoy the story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. The silence in the Whitcomb Library was not the peaceful quiet of study, but the heavy, airless stillness of a tomb dedicated to forgotten wealth. It was a silence that amplified every minute's sound. The faint hiss of the gaslight in the sconces, the rustle of Lydia's borrowed velvet dress, and the rapid, unsteady rhythm of her own heart beneath the stiff lace of her bodice. The room itself was an architectural monument to the Duke Jonathan Whitcomb's enduring, if slightly diminished, lineage. High, arched windows, draped in thick, crimson velvet that absorbed all light and sound, looked out onto a courtyard she dared not visit. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with cases of rare, leather-bound books that smelled of aged paper and bitter antiquity. Everything in this mansion, the carved oak paneling, the imported Persian rugs, the marble fireplace mantelpiece where a pair of gold-plated clocks stood sentinel, exuded an effortless, inherited power that was utterly foreign to Lydia Farnham. Lydia was, by necessity, a masterpiece of artifice. Her 25 years had been a brutal education in survival, culminating in the creation of Miss Lydia Farnham, daughter of a minor, long-impoverished noble family from the South. The identity was just credible enough to pass muster with the most cursory of checks, yet flimsy enough that one probing question could shatter her entire existence. She had won the position as the Duke's personal assistant, a role that demanded intelligence, discretion, and proximity, by presenting a flawless facade, quiet, elegant, and observant. Her hair, the color of burnt umber, was meticulously pinned in a severe style that lent her a false air of aristocratic severity, starkly framing a face that the image showed to be sensitive and prone to worry. The deep emerald green of her velvet gown was both a shield and a cage. The luxurious fabric felt hot against her skin, a constant, physical reminder of the wealth she was stealing into. She moved through the Duke's private study with a practiced, almost unnatural stillness. Her role required handling sensitive documents, yet her hands rarely touched anything without a careful, almost ritualistic preparation. A subtle glance around, a quick smoothing of her gloves. She was terrified of leaving behind any evidence of the woman she truly was. A woman whose hands knew the rough texture of lye soap and the weariness of 12-hour days, not the soft, pampered existence of a gently bred lady. Her current task, organizing a chaotic pile of the Duke's forgotten correspondence, was less about efficiency and more about maintaining the image of working. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the head housekeeper, Beverly Haskins, was watching. Haskins was a creature of sharp edges and suspicious eyes, whose presence was a silent, unblinking sentinel over the manor's social integrity. Lydia had already registered the slight tightening around Haskins's lips during their initial meeting, an unspoken disapproval of a new, well-dressed noble entrant who seemed too polished to be merely a penniless cousin. Even the chief steward, Darius Holt, calm and composed, possessed an unnerving ability to see too much, noticing the reflexively deep curtsy Lydia performed when startled, a giveaway of her lower-class training. The very air in the study felt charged, thick with the weight of her deceit. It wasn't just the staff she feared. It was the historical weight of the place itself, the constant whisper that she did not belong here, that she was an intruder destined to be caught and cast out. The consequences of exposure would not simply be dismissal. The Duke's position, his bitterness, and the potential involvement of the law made the stakes life-altering. Every day she remained was an act of profound desperation and courage, a high-stakes gamble she could not afford to lose. The memory of the small, cramped room she had escaped, the gnawing hunger, and the pervasive fear of the manipulative man who haunted her past were the iron clamps that kept her tethered to this dangerous place. She had nowhere else to go. Lydia paused, her fingers drifting over a cold, heavy paperweight shaped like a lion's head, a stark symbol of the Duke's reputation. She allowed herself a moment of self-scrutiny, her only act of true honesty. She withdrew the small, tarnished silver mirror from the hidden pocket inside her skirt, the very pocket she had embroidered herself years ago, another detail that would betray her. The mirror was not for vanity. It was an anchor to the truth. She held it up, scrutinizing the composure she projected. The wide, steady eyes that held emotional pain but never let her voice shake, the perfect line of her jaw. "Miss Farnham," she whispered internally, testing the name's solidity. Felt like glass, beautiful, reflective, and fragile. The internal conflict was a grinding millstone around her soul. Survival necessitated the lie, but the lie chained her to the victim of her worst mistake. Jonathan Whitcomb. He was 10 years older, the epitome of cold, calculating polish, and he rarely showed emotion. Yet, when he looked at her, those intense gray eyes didn't just see Miss Farnham. They looked through her, searching for the ghost of the woman who had helped Miles Carraway nearly ruin him. Years ago, she had been a pawn, manipulated by Miles, who painted the scheme as a victimless transfer of wealth. She had helped him with the paperwork, using a temporary position in a solicitor's office to forge a key document that compromised Whitcomb's estate. She had believed Miles's charm, his gentle lies, and his promises of a new life far away from poverty. The reality was a humiliating, public scandal that stripped Jonathan of dignity and trust, leaving him with an indelible bitterness that manifested in his quiet power and his habit of staring too long. Lydia's goal was simple: to earn enough to run. But her deep flaw was the self-punishment that drove her to stay. She felt she deserved to live in this viper's nest, under the eye of the man she wronged, forced to confront her sin daily. It was a private, agonizing penance. The scar of that betrayal was not just on Jonathan's life. It was burned into her own sense of worth. And then there was Miles. The nobleman she had betrayed Jonathan for was now the chief threat to her existence. Miles Carraway, charming, manipulative, and relentless, was the real reason she needed to disappear. She knew he was looking for her. He saw her not as a woman, but as a useful weakness, a resource to exploit. The moment he discovered she was working for Jonathan, he would use it to force her into a new, darker scheme, potentially exposing both her lie and her past crime. The knowledge of Miles's ruthlessness made every waking hour a torture. She had to stay, she had to save, and she had to be perfect because the alternative was the street, prison, or Miles. She needed to overcome the crippling self-condemnation that whispered she was just as shallow as Jonathan believed her to be. She remembered a brief moment from the past, before the betrayal. Jonathan had been a different man, less guarded, capable of a wry smile that softened the severity of his features. He had shown her a casual kindness she hadn't expected from a duke. That memory, faint and painful, was the one thing that truly drove her internal conflict. Was the cold, calculating man before her a true reflection of his character, or merely the hardened shell she had created? And could she, a liar, ever deserve to find goodness in the man she wronged? Lydia's contemplation was shattered by a sound that instantly transformed the tranquil library into a high-pressure interrogation room. It wasn't the light tread of a servant or the heavy footfall of a tradesman. It was a decisive, powerful sound, almost silent, yet carrying the weight of authority. The unmistakable scrape of the heavy oak door handle turning, followed by the quiet thud of the Duke's polished boot landing firmly on the thick rug just outside the study entrance. Jonathan was here. Lydia's physical reaction was immediate and reflexively honed. The tarnished mirror vanished into her pocket with a quick, silent movement. Her shoulders straightened, pulling her spine into the rigid, perfect posture of a minor noblewoman. The look of deep-seated anxiety in her eyes was instantaneously replaced by a cool, polite blankness, the mask of Miss Farnham. This transition was a matter of survival, a muscle memory perfected over months of terrifying deception. Every nerve ending screamed the warning, performance now. She turned towards the study door, where the imposing silhouette of the Duke now filled the frame, eclipsing the light from the hall. He was 36, tall, and dressed in impeccable dark wool that seemed to absorb color. He walked with a quiet power, and his expression was habitually cold. His jaw set in a line of permanent dissatisfaction that was likely a direct result of the shame she had helped inflict upon him. Miss Farnham. His voice was deep, perfectly modulated, and devoid of warmth, like the precise tick of the gold-plated clocks on the mantelpiece. He didn't ask a question. He merely stated her name, a pronouncement that hung in the air, testing the validity of the sound. "Your Grace," Lydia replied, her voice soft, measured, and pitched just high enough to convey deference without sounding weak. She executed a flawless but consciously restrained curtsy, careful not to dip too low, which would be the lower-class giveaway. His gray eyes settled on her, and the staring began. It was not a glance. It was an inspection, a slow, deliberate sweep that took in the high-piled elegance of her hair, the exact position of her hands, the fabric of her dress. It was the gaze of a man who was searching for a flaw, for the telltale fracture in the glass. He carried the aura of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. "I trust the organization of the correspondence is satisfactory?" he asked, stepping fully into the room. He didn't wait for her answer, instead walking to the window, his back momentarily to her, a gesture of careless power. "Quite satisfactory, Your Grace. The 1887 accounts were filed separately, and I have extracted the list of outstanding debts you requested," she responded, reciting the prepared facts of her work, focusing on clarity and intellect rather than emotion. She hoped her competence would outweigh his lingering suspicion. He turned slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze returning to her face with unnerving intensity. "Good. Competence is rare, Miss Farnham, especially when disguised by such a delicate appearance." The implied judgment, the hint that he saw her as a beautiful but fragile object, was a low blow. It forced her to hold her breath, refusing to flinch. She met his gaze, praying he only saw the polite, elegant assistant. He paused for what felt like an eternity, the heavy silence of the library tightening around them. The atmosphere was so thick with unspoken history and present suspicion that Lydia felt the pressure physically, like a vice clamping down on her chest. Then he delivered the punchline, not with anger, but with chilling calculation. "There is something about you, Miss Farnham," he said, taking a step closer, forcing her to resist the urge to step back. "Something familiar. It is a quality I find difficult to place. I find I am still waiting for the memory to return." It was a threat cloaked in casual observation. He was telling her, "I know you. I'm just waiting to remember where." The confrontation had begun, not with an explosion, but with a quiet, lethal whisper in the heart of the library. Lydia's carefully constructed sanctuary had become a cage, and the jailer was the only man who knew the lock. The clock on the landing chimed 6 times, the sound muffled by the thick tapestries, yet it struck Lydia's nerves with the metallic clarity of a warning bell. She was awake long before the light, the luxurious, feather-down mattress offering no solace against the sharp edges of her fear. This was the routine now. Awake before the staff stirred, dress without error, and descend into the gilded cage of Whitcomb Manor to perform the role of Miss Farnham. Every single day required absolute perfection, and every day tested the limits of her elegant composure. Lydia rose, moving with a calculated economy of motion. Her quarters, though modest by the Duke's standards, were still lavishly appointed, a constant, insidious reminder of the chasm between her true past and her fabricated present. She studied her reflection in the dressing table mirror, committing the elegant lines of her face to memory, checking for any trace of the fatigue or panic that constantly clawed at the edges of her self-control. Her clothes were a carefully managed wardrobe of borrowed grace, purchased with the last of the money she had scraped together from her frantic flight, enough to buy 5 serviceable, high-collared dresses that spoke of respectable, if threadbare, nobility. Today, it was the dusty rose wool, chosen specifically for its severe cut and its ability to absorb light, making her appear demure and less conspicuous. She pinned her hair with painstaking care, each strand secured tightly, mirroring the control she sought to impose on her racing thoughts. Any loose curl might suggest a wildness she could not afford, any imperfection a crack in the dam of her identity. She thought of the Duke, Jonathan Whitcomb. He was the gravity around which her terrified existence now orbited. His final words from the previous evening, "I find I am still waiting for the memory to return," were not a gentle warning, but a meticulous threat, a promise of inevitable recognition. He hadn't accused her. He had merely stated that she was, to him, an unsolved puzzle, a familiar error he would eventually correct. This calculated coldness, this refusal to dismiss or reveal her immediately, was infinitely more terrifying than an outburst of rage. It meant he was savoring the prospect of her ruin, or perhaps, testing the depth of her deception for reasons she could not yet fathom. His was a vengeance of slow, psychological attrition. Lydia made her way to the dining room, ensuring her pace was neither too quick, like a servant rushing to duty, nor too slow like a lazy mistress. She took her breakfast alone in a small, seldom-used parlor, a careful choice to avoid the chaos of the kitchen staff and the scrutiny of the family dining hall. Each sip of weak tea and bite of toast was a conscious effort, a mechanical refueling for the day's performance. She was hyper-aware of the placement of her knife and fork, of the angle of her wrist, terrified that some instinctive working-class gesture, a sudden grab for the bread, a noisy placement of the cup, would betray the years of effort it had taken to master the veneer of breeding. Her duties began promptly at 8 in the Duke's private study, the same room where the tension had become almost unbearable the day before. The morning passed in a sustained, high-alert haze. Lydia catalogued historical documents, transcribed faded ledger entries, and organized correspondence. She performed flawlessly, her quick mind and sharp memory, gifts honed by years of needing to remember every detail for survival, proving invaluable. But Jonathan Whitcomb was a relentless presence. He did not sit at his desk. He walked. He paced the circumference of the vast room, his hands always clasped behind his back, his profile severe, etched against the morning light. He would stop occasionally, usually when Lydia was concentrating on a delicate transcription, and stand for long, agonizing moments simply watching. The sheer duration of his calculated coldness was crushing. He never spoke unless to give an instruction, and his instructions were crisp, precise, and impersonal. Yet, every minute or so, his eyes would drift from the paneled walls or the fireplace and settle on Lydia. It was a stare that felt less like observation and more like dissection. She felt the slow burn of his gaze travel across the arch of her neck, rest on the subtle tremble of her ink pen, and hover over her eyes. This was not the stare of a man intrigued, but of a man verifying a hypothesis. He is trying to remember my face in a different context, she thought, the paranoia spiking. He is searching for the common girl in the expensive dress. To counter this, Lydia made sure her posture was perfectly erect, her hands steady, and her gaze always directed at the paper. She allowed herself no reaction, no shift in breathing, no flicker of acknowledgement that she felt the heat of his inspection. She focused every ounce of her will on the paper, the script, the dusty history of the Whitcomb estate, making herself a necessary, invisible component of the furniture. Once, she misjudged the distance of his pacing. She reached for a roll of parchment too quickly, and her hand brushed the sleeve of his coat. It was a minuscule physical contact, but the jolt was electric, a sudden, blinding terror. She froze. "Pardon, your grace," she murmured instantly, pulling her hand back as if burned, the words escaping in a hushed formality. Jonathan stopped, turning his head slowly toward her. His expression did not change. He remained a mask of polished stone. But his eyes, usually cold, held a flicker of something sharp, recognition, or perhaps satisfaction at her raw, exposed terror. He studied her for 3 full, suffocating breaths before offering a minimal response. "Careful, Miss Farnham. Clumsiness is a liability in this house." The reprimand was delivered without heat, making it devastatingly effective. It was a reminder that she was not just an employee. She was a variable in his meticulously ordered world, and any deviation would be punished. She resumed her work, her concentration splintered, knowing that for the next hour, he would not move from that spot, waiting for her to make another error, another gesture that belonged to the lower-class girl she pretended not to be. The air only cleared mid-morning when the head housekeeper, Beverly Haskins, made her scheduled inspection of the Duke's private apartments. If Jonathan's scrutiny was calculated and patient, Beverly's was sharp, instinctive, and immediately hostile. Beverly Haskins was a woman sculpted by discipline and years of managing aristocratic chaos. She was 52, rigid in her black bombazine gown, her face severe, her hair pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to defy gravity. She did not merely enter the room. She entered a space, her presence instantly demanding a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Beverly's eyes, the color of hard slate, bypassed the Duke and settled immediately on Lydia. She performed a cursory inspection of the silver and the furniture, but the true target was always the new assistant. Lydia knew instinctively that Beverly saw through the polite lie. The housekeeper, a woman who had worked her way up through sheer labor and ruthless efficiency, was a connoisseur of class markers, and Lydia's perfectly restrained curtsy, her 2 elegant hands, and her polished, quiet voice were all evidence of an impostor who had cheated her way past the servant's entrance. "Miss Farnham." Beverly's voice was dry, possessing the brittle texture of old parchment. "I trust your duties are proving less taxing than you anticipated?" The question was laced with condescension, a direct challenge to Lydia's legitimacy. Beverly implied that a true noblewoman, especially one supposedly of an impoverished house, would find any form of clerical labor a tedious hardship. Lydia met the stare, forcing a small, serene smile that felt entirely alien to her. "Not at all, Mrs. Haskins. The Duke's records are meticulously maintained. It is a pleasure to organize such comprehensive histories." She used the word comprehensive, a piece of calculated intellectual vocabulary, intending to signal that she was educated and understood the scope of the Duke's affairs. Beverly's lip curled, a fleeting, almost invisible movement of contempt. "Indeed, one must have the constitution for it, however. I have seen many impoverished nobles who arrive with fine airs and little aptitude for sustained work. They are often more interested in the reputation than the responsibility." It was a direct accusation, a clear warning that Beverly was watching and waiting. Lydia felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she immediately suppressed it, knowing that emotion was weakness. She focused her eyes on a spot just above Beverly's shoulder, using the technique Miles had once taught her. "Never let the enemy see the fear in your eyes." "My circumstances necessitate the responsibility, Mrs. Haskins," Lydia replied, keeping her tone even and polite, injecting a carefully measured amount of quiet dignity into her voice. "I value the opportunity." Beverly Haskins said nothing more, merely giving a stiff nod that clearly registered the inadequacy of Lydia's defense. Her glance swept over the Duke, who was now leaning against the mantelpiece, observing the exchange with cool detachment, before she exited the room, leaving behind a sharp, clean scent of starch and disapproval. Lydia let out a silent, barely perceptible breath. She had survived the first direct confrontation, but she knew Beverly Haskins would not relent. The housekeeper was now an active internal threat, a hawk perpetually circling, waiting for the slightest mistake. A forgotten date, a lapse in etiquette, a misplaced accent, to confirm her immediate, hostile suspicion. The afternoon passed with the same excruciating slowness. Jonathan remained distant, yet always present, his silence a heavy shroud. By the time the final clock chimed, marking the end of the workday, Lydia's physical and emotional energy was depleted, worn thin by the continuous mental effort of maintaining the deception. She returned to her small room, sinking onto the edge of the bed with a grateful sigh that was instantly stifled. Even here, she could not truly relax. She needed to review the day's events, categorize her successes, the seamless handling of the foreign currency accounts, and her failures, the brief moment of panic when she touched Jonathan's sleeve. She removed the elegant velvet dress, folding it meticulously. A habit learned not from a maid, but from a laundry woman, an instinctive preservation of expensive fabric. As she changed into a simple, serviceable nightgown, she walked to the small window. Outside, the great Whitcomb estate was settling into the deep blue twilight. The silence of her room, once a comfort, was now an oppressive vacuum, filled only by her terror. She was living in a beautiful, dangerous trap, surrounded by exquisite, silent things that could never be hers, ruled by a cold, powerful man whose memory was slowly, inevitably, aligning with the truth. She picked up the tarnished silver mirror again, the final keepsake from the life she betrayed. She stared into her own reflected eyes, seeing the exhaustion, the fear, and the profound, crushing loneliness of a person who could never truly be herself. The weight of the lie was not in the words she spoke, but in the constant suppression of every natural instinct, every honest emotion. Jonathan Whitcomb knew her, or, at least, his deep, instinctual sense of injustice and his sharp intelligence knew she was a fraud. He was allowing her to stay, allowing her to work, allowing her to believe she was safe, all while the clock ticked down to the moment his memory, or his vengeance, would strike. She was the star of a private, elaborate play, and he was the sole, cold-eyed spectator, waiting for the curtain to fall on her inevitable ruin. And she had to continue, because lurking beyond the walls of the gilded cage, closer than she dared to imagine, was Miles Carraway, the man who was truly capable of destroying her soul. She was trapped between the cold, calculated anger of the Duke and the charming, ruthless control of the nobleman she betrayed him for. She could not run, so she must be perfect. She put the mirror away, extinguished the light, and lay down in the dark, preparing for the next exhausting day of flawless, terrified performance. Lydia began to internalize the geography of Whitcomb Manor not as a home, but as a map of her own danger. Each corridor was a stretch of the tightrope she walked, each chamber a potential trap. Her duties required an intimate knowledge of the Duke's personal and professional spaces, forcing her to move deeper and deeper into his life, and thus, closer to the past she was fleeing. The drawing rooms were vast stages for phantom social events. The galleries, lined with Whitcomb ancestors whose stern gazes seemed to follow her every step, were silent witnesses to her fraud. Yet, no space held the cold, suffocating menace of the Duke's private study and the attached, seldom-used library office where she spent most of her days. She had been in the manor for 10 days, and already, the smell of the study, old leather, pipe tobacco, and the faint metallic scent of ink had become the smell of her anxiety. It was here, surrounded by the physical evidence of the Whitcomb legacy she had once helped to compromise, that the walls felt thinnest and the ghosts of her past were most tangible. She ran her hand over the massive globe in the corner, its antiquated brass stand gleaming, and felt a profound, aching disconnect. Her world was small, constrained by fear. The Duke's world spanned continents and generations. Her actions, driven by the frantic need of a girl who had nothing, had nearly damaged this sprawling empire. The manor was a constant, excruciating reminder of what she had done, and more pressingly, why she was still doing it. Her current task involved organizing a collection of deeds and property maps that detailed the Whitcomb landholdings in the mid-Atlantic states, the very assets that had been destabilized by the financial scheme. As she meticulously indexed the documents, her fingers trembled not from fatigue, but from the sudden, sharp recollection of the precise moment she became complicit. It had been 4 years ago. She was 21, working as a temporary clerk in a solicitor's office, overwhelmed by the city and desperate for a way out of her squalid circumstances. She was smart, quiet, and overlooked, the perfect combination for Miles Carraway. Miles, already 30, was a minor nobleman, impeccably charming and dangerously persuasive, capable of making even the most monstrous request sound like a logical inevitability. He had found her, singled her out, and showered her with attention, making her feel seen for the first time in her life. He had presented the scheme with cool, reasoned logic. "It is merely an administrative adjustment, Lydia, a temporary transfer of liquid assets, correcting an ancient oversight. Whitcomb is arrogant. He won't even notice until it's too late, and by then we will be free." He promised her a life free from the suffocating poverty she knew, a clean slate in a new territory where her lack of noble birth wouldn't matter. He promised escape. The betrayal had involved forging the signature on a crucial transfer document and leveraging her access to shift funds and property titles into a shell holding Miles controlled. It was a technical, clean crime on paper, but the consequences were devastating. When the details eventually broke, the scandal had been ferocious. The Duke was accused of reckless management, poor oversight, and even suspected of questionable dealings. Though he eventually recovered the bulk of the assets, the damage to his reputation, his most valuable intangible asset, was complete. He was forever tainted by the public perception of financial instability and gullibility. Lydia had fled Miles the moment the funds were secured, realizing with sickening clarity that she was merely a tool he intended to discard or reuse until she was ruined. She had taken a small, untraceable portion of the ill-gotten funds, enough to disappear for a few months and create the Miss Farnham identity. She bore the guilt for the crime, and the deeper shame for having been so easily duped by Miles's polished cruelty. Holding the Duke's property deed in her hand now, the weight of the document felt like a physical accusation. She remembered seeing the Duke's face on a hastily sketched newspaper portrait during the height of the scandal, cold, hard, and ravaged by public scorn. She saw that face every day now, in person, and the bitterness was deeper, sharper, and more imposing than any drawing could convey. It was this profound, inescapable guilt that anchored her to her current fate. She saw her presence here, under the Duke's unrelenting scrutiny, as a form of self-imposed imprisonment. This viper's nest was her penance. She deserved the fear, the constant paranoia, and the slow, agonizing wait for the inevitable moment when Jonathan would look at her and remember. Every sharp word from Beverly Haskins, every chilling silence from Jonathan, was a lash that she accepted, believing it was the only way to atone for her weakness and complicity. If she were truly a good person, she would confess, but confession meant immediate ruin and handing her fate over to the law, which would invariably lead her back to Miles's influence. So, she chose the protracted suffering of the lie. Her meticulous study of the manor's internal workings extended beyond the documents. She learned the rhythms of the house, the timing of the servants' rounds, the location of the secondary staircases, the precise moment the housekeeper retreated to her private office. She learned when Jonathan Whitcomb preferred his tea, where he kept his most sensitive records, and how his jaw twitched when a business deal displeased him. This intimate knowledge was both her protection and a sickening form of continued betrayal. She was learning her employer's weaknesses, even now. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her employment, the day stretched long past its normal close. A critical foreign delegation was due to arrive early the next morning, and the Duke required a detailed, translated itinerary of their proposed factory visits. Lydia was the only person with the linguistic skills and the required discretion to finish the task. The house had settled into its nighttime slumber. The gaslights were lowered, casting the library in deep shadows, and the vast spaces were permeated by a comforting, drowsy quiet. Lydia worked by the single bright lamp on the central reading table. The heavy silence was a welcome relief from the constant visual scrutiny of the day. She was alone, finally, or so she thought. She allowed herself to drop her shoulders slightly, the tightness easing from her neck, momentarily shedding the mask of Miss Farnham to be simply Lydia, the exhausted girl trying to meet an impossible deadline. She was bent over a large map, translating logistical notes into concise English, her pen scratching softly against the heavy paper. The translation demanded absolute concentration, forcing her mind away from fear and guilt, the brief respite a form of narcotic relief. She didn't hear him approach. Jonathan Whitcomb walked the manor like a ghost, his footfalls absorbed by the thick rugs, his presence announced only by the sudden, tangible drop in the temperature of the air around her. Lydia became aware of him only when his shadow fell over the map, eclipsing the lamplight. She jerked upright, her pen skittering across the table, a gasp caught in her throat. The sudden movement was a lapse, unprofessional, panicked, and utterly revealing. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice a dry rasp, the blood immediately hammering in her ears. She forced her hands, which were shaking violently, to rest flat on the table, trying to ground herself. Jonathan stood a foot behind her, a towering silhouette in the dim light. He looked less severe now, perhaps simply tired, his greatcoat draped loosely over one shoulder, suggesting he had just returned from an engagement. Yet his eyes, catching the lamplight, were sharp and focused entirely on her. "I apologize, Miss Farnham. I did not intend to startle you," he said, the apology sounding more like a statement of fact than an expression of remorse. "I was retrieving my notes on the new Amsterdam charter. I see you are still working." "Almost complete, Your Grace," she replied, picking up her pen and willing the tremor in her fingers to cease. "I wished to ensure the translation of the factory schedule was precise for the morning." He took a slow step around the table, not to sit down, but to approach the spot where her notes lay exposed. His movement was deliberate, invasive, forcing her back into the high-tension posture of the day. He leaned over the table, his breath warm on her temple, his presence an overwhelming physical weight. "Let me see," he commanded softly, his hand gesturing towards the paper. Lydia slid the sheet toward him. It contained her fast-paced, handwritten notes, a blend of Portuguese and her own rapid English shorthand, scrawled in her familiar, elegant, but distinctive script. Jonathan did not immediately read the notes. He focused entirely on the handwriting. He slowly circled the table, moving past her to pick up a ledger from the stack of materials she had organized earlier. He flipped through the pages of the antique book, then returned to the table and placed the ledger down beside her notes. The sudden proximity of the two documents, the old archival book and her freshly scrawled paper, was immediately alarming. The ledger, she knew, contained the detailed financial summaries from the very year of the scandal, summarized by the previous Duke's assistant. Jonathan pointed a long, cold finger at a column of figures in the ledger. The former clerk responsible for this ledger had a rather unusual flourish on her capital Fs, he observed, his voice low, conversational, utterly calm. "Very distinctive, almost like an open knot." He then moved his finger 1 inch to the notes she had just written, her own handwriting still wet with ink. "I notice that your own capital F, Miss Farnham," he continued, looking up from the paper to meet her eyes, "possesses the exact same peculiar flourish, an open knot." Lydia's entire body went rigid. The air rushed out of her lungs. The silence returned, crushing and final. It was not the fraud or the lack of noble birth, or the betrayal of the past he had noticed first. It was her handwriting, an intimate, indelible mark of her identity that had not changed in years, a constant that had somehow survived the dramatic upheaval of her life. It was a detail so minute, so precise, that no casual observer would ever notice it. Only someone who had studied the previous documents with meticulous attention, someone who had lived and breathed the data during the scandal, would remember such a trivial thing. Her mind raced, a frantic animal trapped in a corner. Deny it? Lie? Claim coincidence? She opened her mouth, but only a dry, desperate whisper escaped. Jonathan, however, did not give her the chance to lie. He leaned closer, his eyes locking onto hers, and delivered the final, chilling confirmation that her time was limited. His voice dropped lower, becoming a conspiratorial murmur that seemed intended only for her. He let his gaze fall to the paper again, savoring the moment before lifting his eyes back to her face. A hint of something devastatingly cold, vengeance finally finding its mark, flickering in his gray depths. Remarkably familiar, he concluded, his statement not a question but a sentence. It hasn't changed in years, Miss Farnham. And neither, I suspect, have you. The revelation that Jonathan Whitcomb knew her handwriting, a unique and permanent biological signature, had fractured the foundation of Lydia's composure. She was no longer simply waiting for recognition. She was actively residing in a space where her exposure was already certain. Only the timing and the execution remained unknown. The Duke's cold finality. It hasn't changed in years, Miss Farnham. And neither, I suspect, have you, echoed in every empty space of the manor, a promise of slow, deliberate retribution. It drove her deeper into the meticulous paranoia that had become her survival mechanism. She began using a heavy, impersonal clerk's hand for all official correspondence, deliberately disguising the flourish, a desperate, futile attempt to erase the evidence he already possessed. Her terror manifested in an obsessive adherence to the role. She perfected the shallow breathing of a woman unaccustomed to physical strain, maintained the vague, informed knowledge of current affairs expected of her class, and rigidly controlled her hands to prevent the instinctive muscle memory of years of labor from surfacing. Yet, the pressure cooker of the manor was forcing inconsistencies to the surface, cracks that were immediately noticed by the man whose duty it was to observe everything. Darius Holt, the chief steward. Darius Holt moved through the manor like a current of still water, calm, composed, and penetrating. He was the nerve center of the vast household, the quiet conductor who orchestrated the seamless performance of aristocratic life. Unlike Beverly Haskins, whose observations were filtered through the rigid lens of class resentment, Darius viewed people with a detached, clinical brilliance. He saw behavior, posture, and rhythm, reading the staff and the guests as one might read a complex ledger. To him, Lydia was not an imposter to be exposed, but a compelling series of anomalies to be charted. He first noticed the curtsy. In her frantic desire to demonstrate deference, Lydia consistently dropped her knees an inch too low, held the pause a moment too long, and rose with a swift, almost athletic efficiency. It was a curtsy perfected not for a drawing room, but for a strict mistress demanding perfect, grateful obedience. It spoke of a lifetime of training in deference, not breeding. He noted it in the quiet column of his mind. Anomaly 3, overcorrection of deference. He watched her fear, not the visible panic, but the underlying tension that never left her shoulders. The quick, darting glances she cast whenever a door opened unexpectedly, the way her hand flew to her collar when a bell rang. She carried the perpetual posture of someone who expected to be hit, not addressed. And this fear was only ever visible when she believed she was unobserved, usually in the quiet moments before the Duke arrived, or when she was standing near the back corridor that led to the service stairwell. Darius also began to notice how Jonathan Whitcomb watched her. The Duke's cold, calculated observation of Miss Farnham was unlike his usual detachment. It was sustained, precise, and possessed a dark, proprietary focus, like a chess player studying a captured piece. Darius knew the Duke's bitterness ran deep, and that whatever game was being played with Miss Farnham, it was far more personal than a simple employment evaluation. The tension between the two was palpable. A taut, humming wire stretching across the main hall, and Darius, an expert in household logistics and human nature, understood that this wire was about to snap. The greatest anomaly, however, was her knowledge. One late afternoon, she was organizing a delivery of new linen meant for the Duke's private sitting room. The order had arrived, and Darius was overseeing the footmen. The linen was expensive, finely woven cambric, but the delivery had been poorly packaged, and a corner of one sheet had caught on the rough wood of the crate, resulting in a small yet significant tear. Beverly Haskins, who materialized out of thin air whenever an error occurred, immediately began berating the junior footman. "Careless! This is ruinous cambric. Who will mend this without marking the stitch?" Lydia, momentarily forgetting her role as the passive noble assistant, stepped forward, her attention fixed on the tear, an instinct born of years of mending her own family's clothes by necessity. Without thinking, she reached out and ran her thumb over the delicate tear. "It will not fray further, Mrs. Haskins," Lydia said quietly, her voice reverting to the firm, practical tone of a working woman assessing damage. "If it is repaired with a running whipstitch, using silk thread pulled from the edge of the hem, the mend will disappear entirely once pressed. A proper noble lady's maid would know this. It is not difficult." The statement, precise, technical, and delivered with the confident authority of a skilled seamstress, hung in the air. A noblewoman would have called for her maid. A minor noblewoman might simply sigh in distress. But Lydia had offered a technical, trade-specific solution. Beverly Haskins's eyes narrowed to slits. It was the confirmation she needed. She opened her mouth, ready to deliver a scathing, exposing rebuke about Miss Farnham's shockingly practical knowledge of needlework, a trade far beneath a lady. But before Beverly could speak, Darius Holt intervened. His voice was smooth, deep, and perfectly modulated, cutting through the sudden tension like a silk blade. "An excellent suggestion, Miss Farnham. Most resourceful," Darius said, stepping casually between Lydia and Beverly, his broad back offering a momentary shield. He addressed the footman, his eyes never leaving the boy. "The cambric, young man, will be taken to Mrs. Higgins in the laundry room for the exact repair Miss Farnham suggested. This is not the first time we have been forced to rely on unconventional knowledge for resource management." He then turned a polite, dismissive smile towards Beverly. "A sharp eye for detail, Mrs. Haskins, but Miss Farnham's mind for logistics serves us well. Now the Duke's letters are waiting." The mention of the Duke's work was the ultimate silencer. Beverly, thwarted, could only give Lydia a furious, narrow look before conceding to Darius's authority and retreating. Lydia realized only after the steward had walked away that he hadn't merely defended her. He had actively covered for her. He hadn't denied her knowledge. He had rebranded it as resource management and logistics, qualities appreciated by the Duke. He had sacrificed the moment of her exposure to the exacting housekeeper. Darius's quiet support continued in subtle, practical ways. When Lydia accidentally used a copper polishing cloth on a silver item, a mistake a housemaid would never make, but a lady would never perform, Darius appeared, taking the cloth and quietly replacing it. When she was required to copy a document in French, a language she spoke well, but whose calligraphy was weak, Darius preemptively offered to have the document prepared by a clerk in the city, citing the Duke's concern for Miss Farnham's workload. He was protecting her from the small slips that could confirm Beverly's suspicions, and perhaps the Duke's. One afternoon, Darius found Lydia alone, organizing the pantry inventory, a duty far beneath her assumed station, but one she had taken on to gain a better sense of the estate's finances and keep her hands busy. He paused in the doorway, his tall, imposing figure casting a long shadow over the shelves of preserved fruit and spices. A strange task for a noblewoman, Miss Farnham, Darius observed, his tone devoid of judgment, merely stating a fact. Lydia slowly replaced a jar of chutney, refusing to meet his eyes. I find the organization soothing, Mr. Holt, and one must understand the entirety of an estate to effectively manage its correspondence. Indeed, a very practical perspective, Darius murmured, stepping closer and pretending to check a stock sheet on the counter. His proximity was close enough for a private conversation, yet his posture remained entirely professional. I believe you are an extraordinarily capable assistant, Miss Farnham, he said, his voice dropping slightly. Your memory is precise, your industry tireless. But you carry the fear of a woman who is not just new to the house, but new to the world you claim. Lydia froze, her blood turning to ice. She had been caught, not by the Duke's memory, but by the steward's intellect. I assure you, Mr. Holt, my circumstances are merely stressful, she managed, her voice barely a whisper. Darius ignored her polite denial. He looked straight at a jar of pickled walnuts, a deep, contemplative expression on his face. The Duke is a man of vast capacity for both kindness and bitterness. He is not a man who forgets, nor is he a man who plays without purpose. He paused, then turned his gaze to her, and for the first time, Lydia saw a hint of profound empathy in his sharp eyes. I also observe how the Duke watches you. I have seen the same look in a man before, the look of a person who is nursing an old grievance. He leaned closer, his whisper quiet enough to be consumed by the spice-laden air of the pantry. I do not know your history, Miss Farnham. I do not care if your birth certificate names a duke or a laundress. My purpose is the efficient running of this house. Beverly Haskins wishes to see you dismissed out of spite. The Duke wishes to see you exposed out of retribution. They are both waiting for you to trip on the small things. He placed a heavy, clean stock sheet on the counter near her hand. The inventory is fine, but your fear is visible. Control your small behaviors, Miss Farnham. Do not let them see your hands working like a common seamstress, or your eyes darting like a thief. I believe in the capacity for change. I believe everyone, even those who have made great mistakes, deserves the chance to rewrite their ledger. He gave her a single, sharp nod that was both a warning and a blessing. Now, please ensure this new stock sheet is filed directly into the Duke's desk. It requires your flawless handwriting. He left the pantry, his footsteps receding slowly, leaving Lydia trembling not just with fear, but with a shock of profound, disorienting gratitude. Darius Holt was not interested in the lie, but in the woman beneath it. He was her unexpected ally, a silent, powerful protector within the viper's nest. He had given her a map of her own weakness, a clear-eyed assessment of the dangers around her, and, most importantly, a fleeting glimpse of human kindness. She realized then that she was being tested by two opposing forces. The Duke, who represented the cold, inevitable justice of the past, and Darius, who offered the possibility of redemption and the precarious hope of a future. She picked up the new stock sheet, her hands steady now, fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. She would maintain the mask, but now she had a single, silent confederate in the shadows of the gilded cage, watching the game, and for the first time since she arrived, she did not feel utterly alone. The game had just become infinitely more complicated. Jonathan Whitcomb stood by the great library window, looking out not at the manicured grounds of Whitcomb Manor, but into a deep well of his own memory. The air in his study felt charged, not with the usual brisk efficiency of his work, but with the suffocating certainty that he was no longer alone in his bitterness. He had confirmed the truth of Miss Farnham's identity, or at least, the identity of the woman who held the pen. The handwriting was a confession signed in ink, yet it was only a partial answer. The woman who bore the same distinctive flourish was currently downstairs, efficiently cataloging the very debts her former actions had complicated. That dissonance was a low, insistent hum beneath the surface of his composure. He was not a man given to sudden, theatrical rage. His vengeance, like his business, was conducted with a cold, devastating precision. He had allowed her to stay after the initial shock of recognition faded, not out of mercy, but because simple dismissal was too quick, too clean. It allowed the betrayer, the girl who, with Miles Carraway, had nearly dismantled his life's work, to simply disappear and resume her life elsewhere. That was unacceptable. The exposure must be total, surgical, and timed to inflict the maximum possible social and emotional harm. It must be a downfall that could not be outrun. Jonathan moved away from the light, back toward the heavy oak desk that was both his fortress and his cage. He was searching for a forgotten promissory note, a minor document required for the morning's correspondence. His fingers swept across the leather blotter, tracing the subtle curve of the wooden lip. His hand dipped into the shallow, open cavity of a side drawer, a place where Miss Farnham, with her uncanny organizational sense, often tucked temporary notes or stray pencils. His fingers closed not on paper or wood, but on something small, cold, and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a mirror, small enough to fit in a palm, its edges heavily tarnished with cheap, common silver. It was not an elegant piece. It was a utilitarian object, the sort of item a person of limited means might carry to ensure a presentable appearance. The silver was worn thin in places, exposing the dull brass beneath, and the back was etched with a cheap, stylized floral pattern that had been rubbed smooth by years of constant use. Jonathan felt a physical shock, sharper and more revealing than the discovery of the handwriting. The paper had confirmed the professional crime. The mirror confirmed the absolute, crushing fraud of her social standing. A noblewoman, even an impoverished one, would possess a better quality vanity mirror, perhaps tortoise-shell or even a modest silver one from a family legacy. This tarnished object was the intimate possession of a working girl, a clerk, a woman who needed to check her appearance quickly and secretly before facing her betters. This cheap metal was the final, unassailable piece of proof. He held it up to the lamplight, its dim reflection catching his eye. In that moment, the cool composure he had maintained for years cracked, and the bitter tide of memory surged through him. He was transported back 4 years, to the aftermath of Carraway's scheme. The financial loss, though substantial, was the least of it. What had truly wounded him was the public spectacle, the whispers in the city, the condescending pity of his peers, all of which suggested he was either incompetent or easily duped, or worse, secretly corrupt. It had required 6 grueling months to stabilize his assets, and even longer to repair the damage to the Whitcomb name, damage that was still subtly, corrosively present in every wary glance he received from fellow investors. It had necessitated the construction of the cold, unfeeling Duke, the impenetrable persona that allowed him to conduct business without the vulnerability of trust. He had sacrificed his warmth, his capacity for easy laughter, and most of his personal life, burying his natural self beneath a mountain of rigid, isolating control. And the girl who had been in the solicitor's office, the quiet, efficient clerk who had provided Miles with the access and the forged signature. He remembered her face with a sudden, painful clarity. She was younger then, more timid, but those eyes, the same wide, intelligent, pain-filled eyes now hidden behind the Miss Farnham mask, were unmistakable. He remembered seeing her holding that very mirror one day near the offices, hastily checking her hat before Carraway intercepted her. The rage that had been a slow, controlled burn now sharpened into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. This was not merely the girl who helped Miles. This was the original wound, presenting herself as the cure. The audacious lie, the sheer nerve required to present herself as an assistant to the man she nearly ruined, was breathtaking. He felt a sudden, fierce obligation to repay that audacity in kind. Simple exposure to Haskins or immediate dismissal was insufficient. She had stolen his reputation. He would steal hers. She had used an assumed identity to secure a position in high society. He would allow her to keep climbing, allowing her to gain a foothold, accumulating social capital, only to yank the rug out from under her in the most publicly devastating manner possible. He would wait until she had secured an invitation to a major ball, or perhaps until she had cultivated a relationship with a respected family. Then he would expose the truth, not just the financial crime, but the depth of her fraud, the fake titles, the fabricated history, the common origins. He would use her competence, her elegant composure, and her hard-won veneer to build the stage for her own spectacular ruin. He would destroy the Miss Farnham facade so completely that the girl beneath would have nowhere left to run. This was justice. Not legal, but personal, a meticulous balancing of the scales of dignity she had destroyed. Jonathan walked to the safe hidden behind a heavy painting, twisting the combination with muscle memory. He retrieved his private, leather-bound journal, a silent repository of his true thoughts and, now, his plans. He rarely wrote in it, reserving the pages for decisions of significant personal import. He opened the journal to a fresh page, the pristine white paper waiting for his sentence. He dipped his pen, a heavy, engraved piece that bore the Whitcomb crest, into the inkwell. The scratching sound of the nib on the vellum was the only noise in the vast room, a sound of absolute finality. He wrote the date at the top, his hand steady. Then, he wrote the subject of the entry, confirming the fact of her guilt.
Lydia Farnham, née.
Lydia, the clerk, identity confirmed via handwriting match and physical evidence. One tarnished silver mirror. He paused. The next line was to be the description of the necessary retribution, the cold articulation of his plan for her downfall. He intended to write, betrayer, conspirator, common thief, but his pen hung above the paper, hovering over the heavy vellum. He found himself unable to set down the condemning words. He looked around the room, taking in the perfect order. The ledgers were correct, the foreign correspondence prioritized, the chaotic mess he had deliberately allowed to accumulate over years, a reflection of his own internal disorder, was now sorted, indexed, and made rational. The house, under her organizational hand, ran with an unprecedented efficiency. She had preempted his needs, corrected his logistical errors, and handled sensitive matters with the kind of shrewd, practical intelligence he rarely found even among his most trusted male colleagues. A capable assistant. That was the truth of the woman currently residing in his manor. She was not merely a thief. She was, ironically, the one person in his household who could untangle the knots of his complicated estate. She was solving the chaos her initial betrayal had helped to create. He had expected to find a sniveling fraud, a frightened, incompetent girl clinging desperately to a lie. Instead, he had found a woman of immense strength, resilience, and intellect, a woman who was maintaining a perfect, grueling performance under the constant, lethal threat of his gaze. And despite his bitterness, despite the knowledge of her deep, personal crime against him, a different, reluctant realization began to surface, quiet and unwelcome. The same qualities that allowed her to orchestrate the betrayal, her sharp mind and her tireless industry, were the very qualities that made her indispensable to him now. Jonathan dipped his pen deeper into the ink, determined to finalize the judgment. Betrayer. But the pen stopped again. He wrote over the single word with an almost violent stroke, not erasing it, but changing the description entirely, forced by a cold honesty he hadn't known he possessed. He wrote instead, the betrayer, the most effective administrator Whitcomb has known in a decade. He leaned back in his chair, the conflict a sudden, unexpected knot in his chest. His heart, long dormant beneath layers of cold control, gave a single, hard, disquieting beat. Vengeance demanded her immediate, total ruin. But the survival of his estate, the silent, deep need for competence, demanded he keep her. The paradox was exquisite. He had her exactly where he wanted her, exposed, terrified, and essential. His plan for slow-burn retribution could proceed, but it would be complicated now, contaminated by a dangerous, rising respect for the very woman he was determined to destroy. The game had shifted. It was no longer about if he would expose her, but when and how to reconcile the ruin of the betrayer with the preservation of the administrator. He closed the journal, locking the truth and his contradictory feelings inside the private pages, the tarnished silver mirror resting beside it. A stark, silent reminder of the intricate, agonizing trap he was now constructing for them both. The discovery of the tarnished mirror and the subsequent private conflict recorded in Jonathan's journal had injected a lethal ambiguity into the manor's atmosphere. The cat-and-mouse game continued, but the rules had become dangerously blurred. Lydia, unaware that her personal relic had been discovered, felt the increased intensity of the Duke's gaze, interpreting it as mounting suspicion of her fabricated identity. Jonathan, on the other hand, was now watching her with a twin purpose, confirming the betrayer for his revenge, and observing the administrator who was swiftly becoming indispensable. The two identities warred constantly in his mind, and that internal battle created a palpable tension between them. The test came unexpectedly, shrouded in the mundane complexity of political finance. Jonathan was preparing for a crucial meeting with a delegation of powerful senators regarding a proposed infrastructure bill, a piece of legislation that, if passed, would significantly benefit the Whitcomb holdings, but only if navigated with absolute precision. The Duke was reviewing the draft of the final address he planned to give, a meticulously worded speech that laid out his support while subtly applying pressure on key swing votes. Lydia was tasked with cross-referencing the financial projections cited in the Duke's draft against the latest quarterly reports. The numbers were vast, the details granular, and the potential for error high. She sat at the corner desk, her pen moving with deliberate speed. The concentration required a welcome distraction from the constant fear. It was in the minutiae of a spreadsheet, detailing the estimated returns on a particular railroad bond issue, that Lydia's mind, honed by years of quick-witted survival, caught a chilling discrepancy. The Duke's prepared remarks cited the bond's expected quarterly yield at 7%, a number based on an initial projection made 6 months prior. Lydia's cross-check revealed that due to a sudden, unpublicized shift in local regulatory policy, the actual, updated maximum projected yield was now only 5.5%. The difference seemed small in the grand scheme of Whitcomb's empire, but politically it was catastrophic. The Duke was preparing to use that inflated figure as a core premise for the bill's profitability, a number that was now demonstrably false. If he presented the 7% figure, his opponents, who would certainly possess the updated regulatory data, would expose the error not as a mistake but as deliberate fabrication, a grievous political and ethical blunder that would instantly discredit the Duke and ensure the bill's failure. The old scandal involving Miles Carraway would be immediately revived, confirming the public's belief in Jonathan's lack of financial integrity. Lydia's hand froze above the paper. She looked at the figure in the Duke's script, then at the regulatory document. The realization was sharp, cold, and absolute. She was holding the key to preventing a public and financial humiliation that would echo the events of 4 years ago. Her first instinctive reaction was terror. To correct the Duke, especially on such a fundamental figure in a major political speech, was an act of insubordination bordering on audacity. It risked provoking the very cold rage she sought to avoid. Yet, to let him proceed was to allow the complete professional annihilation of the man she had already wronged. The instinct to save him warred fiercely with the instinct to save herself. She took a slow, deep breath, stabilizing her heart rate through sheer force of will. She stood, walked across the vast expanse of the study rug, and approached the Duke, who was pacing near the fireplace, committing his prepared remarks to memory. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steady, professional, and entirely devoid of the fear that was churning in her stomach. "I apologize for the interruption, but there is a discrepancy in the 3rd paragraph of your address, concerning the Midland Rail Bond projections." Jonathan stopped mid-stride, turning slowly. His eyes, usually sharp and focused, were momentarily clouded with the distraction of his upcoming engagement. He looked irritated at the interruption. "Yes, Miss Farnham? The figure is 7%. That is correct." Lydia held out the two documents, her hands perfectly steady, showing no visible sign of the internal earthquake. "The initial projection, Your Grace, was indeed 7. However, the regulatory change filed last Tuesday by the State Commission, concerning the Environmental Review Clause, here on page 8, restricts the speed and frequency of the rail usage for the first 2 years of operation. I have calculated the maximum revised yield, factoring in the necessary operational downtime, and the projected return is 5.5%. Presenting the 7% figure, especially when Senator Vane is known to have access to this new filing, would expose you to an immediate, irrecoverable political attack." She did not editorialize or apologize further. She presented the unassailable, cold facts, placing the documents on his heavy ledger. Jonathan Whitcomb remained motionless for a long time, the only sound the low crackle of the fire. He looked first at the documents, scanning the precise legislative language and her neat, cross-referenced notation of the calculated reduction. Then, slowly, he lifted his eyes and looked at Lydia. This was not the cold stare of suspicion she was accustomed to. This was the gaze of a powerful man who had just been pulled back from a precipice by the woman he intended to destroy. There was a faint, almost imperceptible widening of his eyes, a momentary slip in the mask of his composure that registered pure shock, followed immediately by a reluctant, profound respect. He picked up the updated filing, his fingers brushing the parchment. "You discovered this? Within the last hour?" "Yes, Your Grace. It was filed late and is not yet widely circulated." He nodded once, sharply, pocketing the document. "You are quite correct. Vane would have used this to great effect. It would have crippled the bill and revived a certain, unfortunate narrative." He used the euphemism for the scandal, his gaze boring into her, acknowledging their shared, dangerous past without speaking a single incriminating word. He didn't thank her. Jonathan Whitcomb rarely stooped to such common acknowledgments of merit. Instead, he simply altered the trajectory of his pacing, his mind already spinning to adjust his speech. "Amend all references to 5.5%, Miss Farnham, immediately, and secure a copy of that precise filing for my immediate review before I leave." The crisis passed, but the air between them was irrevocably changed. Jonathan had been forced, by the cold logic of self-preservation, to acknowledge her superior competence. The betrayer had just saved the Duke. Later that afternoon, after the senators' meeting had concluded, successfully, as the discreetly revised figures were unassailable, Jonathan called Lydia into the study, ostensibly to dictate follow-up correspondence. The room felt different now, stripped of the immediate threat. As they worked, the Duke paused, leaning back in his leather chair, a rare, reflective posture. The topic had shifted to the social unrest accompanying the infrastructure bill, specifically, the displacement of working families near the new rail lines. "The necessity of progress always comes with a cost, Miss Farnham," Jonathan stated, his tone philosophical, detached. "We provide minimal compensation, of course, but the march of capital cannot be halted for sentimentality." Lydia hesitated. This was not her place. Her role was calculation, not commentary. But the displacement of the working class was a topic fiercely close to her heart, the very condition she had sought to escape through the devastating scheme. Her past, the true self she had buried, surged forward, overriding the instinct for self-preservation. "With respect, Your Grace," Lydia said, her voice dropping, losing its formal polish, gaining a rough, earnest texture. "Compensation is hardly adequate. These families are removed from their communities, their informal networks of support, the only life they have ever known. The cost is not just financial. It is the destruction of their stability. They become vagrants, lost in the city, entirely vulnerable." She spoke with a passionate urgency that was completely foreign to the composed Miss Farnham. She was not advocating for a political position. She was speaking from direct, painful memory. They lose their dignity, their ability to trust, and their children lose any chance of upward mobility. It is not just the march of capital. It is the crushing weight of indifference. She looked at him then, her eyes wide, blazing with an honest fire that revealed the true, compassionate spirit that lay beneath the layers of fear and deceit. She was no longer performing. She was simply Lydia, the girl who had seen the crushing reality of poverty and knew the desperation it bred. Jonathan Whitcomb was absolutely still. He studied her, not with suspicion, but with a profound, consuming curiosity. The elegant Miss Farnham, the polished noblewoman, had vanished, replaced by a passionate, morally fierce advocate for the forgotten. He saw a spirit there, vibrant and complex, a genuine goodness that he had never expected to find in the woman he had filed away as conspirator and thief. The contrast was shocking. The betrayal had painted her as shallow and opportunistic, a willing accomplice to greed. Yet here she was, risking his displeasure to defend the very people she had once fled. He felt an unfamiliar, sudden warmth spread through his chest, a feeling that was the antithesis of the cold bitterness he had cultivated. It was not love, not yet, but a sharp, startling recognition of shared moral sensibility, an electric connection across the vast social and moral gulf that separated them. The hatred that had been his constant companion, the engine of his vengeance, stumbled, momentarily knocked off course. He knew with blinding clarity that he could not dismiss this woman. He could not expose her. Not yet. Not while she possessed this fierce, articulate passion, and not while her competence was saving his own reputation. "You speak of this with conviction, Miss Farnham," he observed, his voice unusually soft, almost questioning. "I speak from experience of the consequences, Your Grace," she replied, the passion receding instantly, the mask snapping back into place. She realized how much she had revealed. She sat down, her hands suddenly cold, ashamed of her lapse. Jonathan did not press her. He merely looked at her for a moment longer, the unfamiliar feeling, a dangerous mixture of respect and a sudden, fierce feeling of protection, warring with his long-held desire for revenge. She was not the black-and-white villain of his memory. She was a woman of devastating contradictions. He returned to his papers, the silence now weighted with unspoken acknowledgement. His mind raced. He knew the truth of her past, yet he was now deliberately defending her actions in the present. He had been preparing to destroy her. Now he was actively seeking to understand her. He found himself thinking, if I expose her now, I destroy an innocent passion, a valuable ally, and the only competent mind in my employment. The vengeance, once so clear and pure, had become contaminated by a confusing, deeply unwelcome protective instinct. Jonathan Whitcomb, the Duke hardened by betrayal, was now fighting a secret war against himself, a war he was dangerously close to losing to the earnest voice and the fierce, burning eyes of the woman he was supposed to hate. The true test of competence was not hers, but his own, whether he could maintain the cold integrity of his revenge when faced with the undeniable goodness of his target. The fragile balance established by Lydia's undeniable competence had only intensified the resentment simmering beneath the starched exterior of Beverly Haskins. The housekeeper, a woman whose life was a testament to the rigorous, unyielding hierarchy of the serving class, viewed Lydia's continued presence as a deep, corrosive insult to the very architecture of the manor. Haskins had watched the Duke almost succumb to a political blunder, only to be saved by Miss Farnham's sharp eyes, and she had observed the subsequent, unsettling change in the Duke's customary coldness, a momentary flicker of respect that was utterly damning. Haskins had failed to trap the assistant in a professional error, and she had been thwarted by the chief steward in a minor social slip. Driven now by a righteous fury that surpassed mere duty, she committed herself to a more invasive, desperate act, the violation of Lydia's private sanctuary. Haskins calculated her move with the chilling precision of a predator. She waited until the Duke had called Miss Farnham to his side for a prolonged dictation session, a requirement for the next day's high-stakes financial meeting, knowing that Lydia would be preoccupied for at least 2 hours. She waited until the evening's shift change had completed, leaving the central stairwells quiet and the long, secondary corridors empty. Moving with the practiced silence of someone who navigates the hidden arteries of a great house, Haskins slipped the master key into the lock of Lydia's modest, third-floor room. The intrusion was not motivated by theft. It was motivated by a certainty of truth. Haskins knew a noblewoman, however impoverished, by the quality of her possessions and the nature of her habits. Miss Farnham had the look of fine china, but Haskins was certain that if she scratched the surface, she would find rough clay. The room was neat, almost aggressively so, the few items of clothing folded with a practical exactitude that spoke of self-sufficiency rather than reliance on a maid. The housekeeper searched methodically, her fingers sliding over the fabric of the meager wardrobe. She found nothing of note until she reached the small, plain writing desk, a place where a true lady would keep her scented stationery. Here, tucked into a deep corner of the bottom drawer, Haskins's patience was rewarded. She first found the embroidery. It was a small, half-finished piece of linen intended to be a handkerchief. The stitch work was undeniably neat, fine, and even displaying a practical mastery of the craft. But the quality of the thread was low. A coarse, homespun cotton, far removed from the fine imported silks used by true aristocratic ladies, even for practice. More damningly, the linen itself was cheap, its weave imperfect, suggesting a remnant or cast-off fabric. The pattern was a simple, repetitive daisy chain, not the intricate, personalized monogramming expected of a gentlewoman. This was the work of a woman who embroidered for utility, for money, or for desperate need, not for leisure. This was irrefutable evidence of a working-class hand. Beside the embroidery, wrapped carefully in a square of brown paper, was the second, more damning find, a worn prayer book. It was not a grand, leather-bound volume from a known publisher, but a small, cheaply printed edition bound in rough canvas, its pages heavily thumbed and stained. The cover was devoid of any gilt or crest, and inside, tucked between the pages of the Beatitudes, was a single pressed wildflower, a common weed. Most revealingly, the end papers bore an inscription, written in a child's uncertain hand and then later traced over by an adult's firmer script. For Lydia. Be safe. May 1878. The inscription did not include a surname, nor did it contain any elegant flourish that spoke of lineage. It spoke only of poverty and a simple, genuine love far removed from the cold complexity of noble life. Beverly Haskins stood straight, a small, grim smile of victory touching her lips. She had found the truth. These were not the possessions of a Miss Farnham of the South. They were the relics of a common girl, a governess or perhaps a superior maid, who had somehow dressed herself up and infiltrated the Whitcomb household. These were the keys to unlocking the whole poisonous deceit. She did not rush. She carefully tucked the embroidery and the prayer book into the pockets of her voluminous black apron and left the room, locking the door behind her, returning the manor to its deceptive tranquility. She then proceeded to the Duke's private study. Haskins chose the moment of presentation with malicious theatricality. She entered the study after the dictation was complete, when Lydia was still present, standing near the desk, alphabetizing the newly signed documents. The Duke was settled in his leather chair, ostensibly reviewing the final letters, but in reality, observing the efficiency of the woman he was still struggling to reconcile with his memory. The presence of both parties, the accuser and the accused, was essential to Haskins's plan to ensure immediate public exposure. "Your Grace," Haskins began, her voice crisp, containing a suppressed excitement that was unusual for her professional demeanor. I apologize for the intrusion, but a matter of severe concern has come to my attention, one that touches upon the integrity of this house and your appointments. Jonathan Whitcomb slowly lifted his eyes from the papers, his gaze instantly cold and assessing. He noted the feverish intensity in Haskins's eyes and the barely controlled tightness of her hands gripping her apron. He knew instantly that she was not here about a leaky tap. "Speak plainly, Mrs. Haskins," he commanded, his tone sharp, silencing any dramatic prelude. Beverly turned her gaze to Lydia, who had frozen, her hand hovering over a pile of papers, the blood draining from her face. Lydia knew that expression. Haskins was hunting, and she had found a scent. "It concerns Miss Farnham." Haskins spat the name out, lending it an ugly weight of falsity. "I have discovered objects in her private quarters that cast insurmountable doubt upon her claims of birth and breeding. I believe, Your Grace, you have employed an impostor, a common girl with professional training, masquerading as a noblewoman." She plunged her hand into her apron pocket and retrieved the embroidery, holding it out between two rigid fingers as if it were a dead mouse. "A noblewoman does not possess common, poorly woven linen, Your Grace. She does not practice the running whipstitch on coarse cotton. This is the work of a servant or a seamstress, not a lady." She then produced the final, devastating piece of evidence, the worn, canvas-bound prayer book. "And this, a book of this quality with a common inscription, is not a family heirloom. It is a relic of the streets. I demand to know why your assistant is concealing the tokens of a common life." The silence in the study was absolute. Lydia was paralyzed, the world slowing down to the agonizing sight of the prayer book, her mother's last gift, dangling in the air, a final, unanswerable proof of her devastating lie. The Duke's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable, calculating. Haskins was correct. These items confirmed everything he had already suspected. The cheap mirror, the handwriting, the truth. It was the perfect moment for the vengeance he had carefully planned. But just as Jonathan's lips parted, ready to deliver the cold, final sentence of exposure, a quiet, deliberate presence filled the doorway. Darius Holt, the chief steward, had entered the study, carrying a small silver tray bearing the Duke's forgotten evening sherry. He had walked into the middle of the execution, and his eyes immediately assessing the tableau, the rigid housekeeper, the paralyzed assistant, the calculating Duke, understood the lethal stakes. Darius moved with smooth efficiency, placing the tray on a side table. He did not rush, nor did he display surprise. He addressed the Duke in a tone of respectful, logistical confusion. "Your Grace, I apologize for interrupting what appears to be a matter of personnel review," Darius said, his voice calmly measured. He then looked at the embroidery and the prayer book held by Haskins, giving them a slow, casual inspection. He allowed a gentle, knowing smile, a look of sophisticated understanding, to play briefly across his features. "Ah, Mrs. Haskins," Darius continued, his gaze returning to the housekeeper, his tone shifting to one of subtle, superior social instruction. "You misunderstand the nature of Miss Farnham's more discreet charitable work, I believe." Beverly Haskins stiffened, her face contorting with immediate fury at his intrusion. "Charity work, Mr. Holt? This is the paraphernalia of a low-born fraud." Darius turned briefly to Jonathan, giving the Duke a look of shared, weary aristocratic understanding, a silent suggestion that the staff's lack of social intelligence was tiresome. He then addressed Haskins directly, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial, informative level. "Surely, Mrs. Haskins, you have heard of the Duke's private, anonymous funding of the St. Jude's Home for Destitute Girls?" Darius asked, inventing the charitable organization with masterful speed and conviction. "It is discreet, a matter of private conscience, and kept entirely off the public ledgers. Miss Farnham, due to her, shall we say, proven capacity for discretion and meticulousness in accounts, was entrusted by the Duke to manage the practical, day-to-day procurement for the home. He walked closer to the embroidery, casually leaning in as if to examine the stitch. This handkerchief, for example. It is a sample. Miss Farnham is required to vet the quality of the thread and the durability of the stitch for the lessons taught to the girls at the home. She is checking the necessary quality for common utility, ensuring the materials are neither too extravagant nor too poor for their purposes. He then delicately took the prayer book from Haskins's rigid fingers, holding the cheap canvas with the gentle respect usually reserved for a priceless artifact. "And the prayer book," he murmured, flipping it open to the inscription. "Miss Farnham, I believe this is an example of the personalized books she is required to obtain, a simple, encouraging inscription, to be given to the girls upon their graduation from the program. A final, sentimental reminder of their journey, is it not?" Darius paused, looking directly at Jonathan, challenging the Duke to contradict him. "The Duke requires Miss Farnham to understand the true needs of the impoverished population they assist, Mrs. Haskins. Her familiarity with common goods and practical utility is precisely why she was entrusted with this private, sensitive duty. It is not an admission of low birth. It is evidence of high social responsibility and the trust placed in her by His grace." The counter-narrative was brilliant. It recontextualized every damning piece of evidence into an asset. The low-quality thread became due diligence. The common book became compassionate discretion. The lack of elegant flourish became professional self-effacement for the sake of anonymity. Darius had woven a complex, socially acceptable lie that transformed Lydia's poverty into a badge of the Duke's secretive benevolence. Jonathan Whitcomb remained silent throughout the entire exchange, his face an impenetrable mask. He knew every word Darius spoke was a complete fabrication, yet the logic was flawless. The steward had done what the Duke himself could not, found a way to preserve the indispensable administrator while acknowledging the evidence against the betrayer. He had provided Jonathan with the perfect escape hatch, a way to keep Lydia and her efficiency without resorting to a direct, obvious lie. The feeling of reluctant protection Jonathan felt for Lydia, the woman who had saved him from political humiliation, solidified into a pragmatic alliance. He would not betray Darius's loyalty by exposing the fabricated charity. "That will be all, Mrs. Haskins," Jonathan finally stated, his voice now devoid of emotion, settling the matter with the cold finality of a gavel striking a block. "Mr. Holt is correct. This is a private matter of the estate's philanthropic requirements. Miss Farnham's discretion in this duty is precisely why she retains her position. I believe you owe Mr. Holt and Miss Farnham an apology for the assumption." Beverly Haskins was utterly defeated. Her face was pale, her certainty shattered by Darius's superior narrative. To accuse the Duke of lying about a charity organization was professional suicide. She gave a stiff, resentful nod, her eyes burning with venomous promise, and retreated from the room, humiliated but not yet broken. Lydia was still trembling, unable to process the audacity of Darius's lie or the devastating relief of her narrow escape. She knew Darius had seen the truth, and had chosen to invent an elaborate fiction to save her. The silent bond between them, a shared secret against the Duke, was now an undeniable reality. Jonathan watched her, his expression unreadable, and Lydia, still unaware that he knew her past crime, only saw the cold gratitude of an employer for a narrowly avoided staff mishap. The Duke's conflict had tilted. The desire for revenge was now battling the necessity of protection, a war won, in this instance, by the quiet intervention of an unexpected ally who valued the truth of competence over the satisfaction of exposure. The morning after the chief steward, Darius Holt, had so masterfully manufactured a shield against Beverly Haskins's accusations, a strange, hesitant calm settled over Lydia. The reprieve was intoxicating, yet it carried the metallic aftertaste of a favor she could never repay, a debt she did not wish to acknowledge. Jonathan's silence regarding the charity work had been the final, implicit confirmation of the new arrangement. He was aware of her lie, He had the evidence, and yet, he chose to protect her for the sake of her competence. She was, in essence, a valuable asset now, a functional forgery he was choosing to preserve. This precarious safety allowed her to relax her shoulders infinitesimally, though the vigilant watchfulness remained fixed in her eyes. The fragile peace was shattered 2 days later, not by an internal upheaval, but by an external invasion. The disruption arrived precisely at 3 in the afternoon, during the quiet, formal hour designated for visitors taking tea in the smaller drawing room. Lydia was present, tasked with serving as the Duke's discreet social aide, a role requiring her to sit quietly and monitor the conversational flow, ready to interject with a specific date or a required name. Jonathan was engaged in a discussion with a solicitor regarding property deeds in the north, the conversation dry, technical, and entirely predictable. The chief steward, Darius Holt, appeared in the doorway, his composure momentarily fractioned by a subtle, almost invisible tightness around his mouth. "Your Grace," he announced, his voice smooth, yet carrying a faint edge of caution that only Lydia, trained to read every minute shift in the household's rhythm, could detect. "You have an unscheduled visitor. Mr. Miles Carraway requests a moment of your time, citing an urgent matter regarding the Northern Rail proposal." The sound of the name struck Lydia like a physical blow. The small porcelain teacup in her hand rattled against the saucer, a sound she instantly smothered by setting the set down with violent gentleness on the mahogany table. Miles, the source of the original wound, the architect of her ruin, the living embodiment of the desperate past she had buried beneath layers of velvet and etiquette. Her breath seized in her chest, the air turning to dust. She focused on the polished surface of the table, willing herself to become invisible. Jonathan Whitcomb's reaction was immediate and profound, yet controlled. The coldness that habitually coated him did not intensify. Rather, it became sharper, purer, like metal plunged into ice. His eyes, fixed on the doorway, showed no surprise, only a deep, abiding contempt. "Carraway," he stated, the name tasting like acid on his tongue. "He is no longer welcome in this house, Mr. Holt. Inform him I am indisposed." "He mentioned he was aware of your previous position regarding him, Your Grace," Darius replied, maintaining his respectful distance. "But he stressed that this matter involves an investment decision of which he is certain you would wish to be apprised immediately. He mentioned the Sheffield holdings." The mention of the Sheffield holdings, a recent, highly sensitive acquisition Jonathan was trying to keep confidential, was the strategic wedge Carraway needed. Jonathan's jaw tightened, the muscle flickering visibly. He was trapped between his personal enmity and his professional necessity. "Very well. Show him in, Mr. Holt. But his time is limited to 5 minutes." Miles Carraway entered the room, and the entire atmosphere shifted from quiet formality to slick, immediate danger. He was still devastatingly handsome, his charisma a weapon honed by years of practice. He was dressed in lighter, more fashionable clothes than the Duke, an aesthetic choice that spoke of careless, fluid wealth, contrasting sharply with Jonathan's severe, tailored permanence. Miles possessed the kind of easy, self-assured confidence that Lydia knew masked a core of absolute, ruthless self-interest. He looked around the room, his eyes performing a quick social inventory. And then he saw her. Lydia was standing slightly behind the Duke, her body angled away, trying to melt into the crimson upholstery of the wall. She could feel his gaze. It was not a searching, skeptical stare like Jonathan's, but a proprietary, immediate recognition. Miles's smile, always charming, became something crueler, something that only the two of them could recognize. The familiar, predatory curve of his lips that signaled he had found a useful weakness. It was a smile of ownership. "Whitcomb," Miles greeted, extending a hand to the Duke with a practiced, casual warmth that Jonathan met with a rigid, minimal shake. "Always a pleasure to brave the chill of your halls, though I am surprised to find you keeping such elegant company." Miles let his gaze drift toward Lydia, finally fixing on her face. "And who is this exquisite addition to your establishment? I don't believe we have had the privilege of meeting." Lydia forced herself to perform the curtsy, the appropriate, restrained curtsy Darius had helped her refine, avoiding the overcorrection. "Miss Farnham, sir. The Duke's assistant." Her voice was steady, utterly controlled, but inside, a violent cold was spreading through her veins. Miles stepped closer, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he might take her hand. He didn't. He merely hovered, his eyes glittering with a perverse amusement. "Farnham," he repeated softly, savoring the false name. "Ah, yes, a charming name, certainly. I feel as though I've heard it whispered somewhere, long ago. A name that sounds like it holds a certain history." Jonathan stepped between them, his presence an immediate, heavy barrier. "Miss Farnham is extremely busy, Caraway. Confine your discussion to the Sheffield matter, if you please. Your time is expiring." The exchange was a masterpiece of hidden conflict. Jonathan was protecting her physically, maintaining the illusion of her identity for his own reasons, while Miles was enjoying the torment, circling his prey. The next 10 minutes were excruciating. Miles presented a convoluted, rapidly paced argument regarding a competing bid for the rail line, using insider terms and market projections to establish his professional validity. Jonathan listened with cold, focused intelligence, occasionally interjecting a sharp, technical question that Miles parried with practiced ease. Lydia, standing slightly apart, was supposed to be monitoring, but her brain was screaming a single word: run. Miles, however, was in control of the social space. As the Duke turned briefly to confirm a detail with his solicitor, Miles saw his opportunity. He moved casually toward a table holding a glass dome that housed a meticulously constructed model of the Whitcomb estate. Lydia, retrieving a dropped document, found herself isolated, momentarily out of the Duke's immediate peripheral vision. Miles leaned in close, his voice dropping to the intimate, compelling whisper she remembered from 4 years ago, the voice that had seduced her into ruin. "Lydia," he breathed. The sound of her real name, a knife, plunged into her composure. She didn't flinch, maintaining her rigid posture, staring straight ahead at the model estate. "I do not know that name, sir. You are mistaken." His cruel smile returned, wider now, predatory and absolute. "Oh, but I never forget a face, my dear, especially one that held the ink pen so neatly when we were signing away the Duke's future. Miss Farnham, is it? So creative. You always did have a flair for fiction." He rested his hand on the table edge beside hers, creating a physical boundary she could not cross. "You look well, Lydia. The velvet suits you. It's certainly a vast improvement on the greasy clerk's uniform you were sporting when you decided to take my money and disappear." Lydia finally risked a glance at him, her eyes burning with a desperate, suppressed terror. "Go. Leave here. The Duke will." "The Duke will what? Fire you? Expose you?" Miles scoffed, the sound quiet and chilling. "Do you think I haven't noticed the tension between you two? Or the cold, hard way he looks at you? He knows, Lydia. Trust me, Whitcomb always finds out. But the question isn't whether he knows, but why he's letting you stay. And that, my dear, is where the real fun begins." He straightened, casting a quick glance back at the Duke, who was now concluding his business with the solicitor. Miles had seconds left. "I am, as you might have deduced from my desperate visit, in a bit of a bind," he confided, his voice now entirely devoid of charm, raw with an urgent necessity. "A very large, irreversible bind involving a failed investment in the American market. I need immediate, untraceable liquidity, and I need access to the Duke's private papers again. The documents he just signed with the solicitor, they involve the transfer of land holdings that can be leveraged if you know the right loopholes." He leaned in again, and this time his words were a final, paralyzing hammer blow. "You, Miss Farnham, are my perfect, unexpected key. You are inside the gilded cage, in the exact position of trust one need. You have access to the inner ledgers, and you have perfected the art of forgery. Your lie is now my leverage, Lydia. The moment you fail to cooperate, I will send the Duke a full, documented account of your involvement in the first scandal, before he has the chance to carry out his own petty vengeance. I will expose you to the whole of London society, destroy the Miss Farnham identity entirely, and leave you nowhere to go but to the authorities. He straightened, his expression reverting to its charming, casual veneer. He gave her a wink, a gesture of devastating, familiar intimacy. The choice is simple, my dear. Help me execute this new scheme, or face the immediate public ruin you've spent 4 years trying to avoid. I'll send you instructions and you will follow them. Welcome back to the team, Lydia. He turned and addressed the Duke with a final, dismissive cordiality. Whitcomb, a pleasure as always. Give Miss Farnham my regards. She truly is an asset. Miles Carroway swept out of the room, leaving behind a wake of toxic charm and a devastating clarity. Lydia stood paralyzed, the polished surface of the table blurring before her eyes. The terror of Jonathan's measured, cold revenge was instantly eclipsed by the immediate, crushing threat of Miles's coercive manipulation. She was caught between two powerful, dangerous men, one who knew her crime and chose to use her competence, and the other who knew her crime and chose to use her fear. The gilded cage had just acquired a second, more lethal lock, and the key was her own devastating, unchangeable past. The long, terrifying game had escalated from survival to high treason. The confrontation arrived not in the privacy of the Duke's study, but in the echoing formality of the Grand Saloon, a room designed for display, not confession. Miles Carroway returned 2 evenings later, his unexpected arrival masked by the pretext of retrieving documents he had conveniently forgotten. The Duke was hosting a small, necessary dinner for several powerful investors whose support was vital to the Northern Rail acquisition. Lydia, dressed in her most severe and unflinching gown, was serving wine, her hands steady, her mind calculating the possible exit strategies. She knew Miles's return was not accidental. It was timed for maximum public leverage, a final, ruthless escalation of his coercive scheme. Miles, impeccably tailored and radiating a false sense of wounded aristocracy, navigated the small gathering with practiced charm, occasionally directing a glance toward Lydia that was laced with silent, proprietary menace. He had already attempted to pass her a sealed envelope containing his instructions, a financial maneuver so brazen it could only lead to ruin, but she had managed to evade the delivery, the fear in her eyes hardening into stubborn refusal. She would not betray the Duke a second time, even if it meant her immediate, total destruction. The tension was a tangible thing, a silence waiting to break. It was Jonathan, however, who engineered the break. He had observed the silent communication between Miles and Lydia, the flash of the envelope, the refusal in her eyes, and understood that Miles's presence was no longer a professional inconvenience, but a direct, lethal threat to his own carefully preserved arrangement. Jonathan's gaze met Miles's across the silver and crystal of the dinner table, a cold, unequivocal challenge. "Mr. Carroway," Jonathan began, his voice cutting through the polite murmur of the room, sharp and compelling. "You claim to be concerned with my interests in the Northern Rail. Yet, your own financial instruments remain tied up in the failed South American rubber venture. Your counsel, therefore, is questionable, being born of desperation, not insight." The attack was sudden and public, a direct strike at Miles's fragile financial standing and his credibility. Miles's face, usually so smooth, registered a momentary shock, the calculated charm flickering under the sudden heat of exposure. He had not anticipated such a swift personal offensive. "My finances are my own affair, Whitcomb," Miles snapped, his voice tight. He knew he had lost the professional battle. He had no choice but to pivot to his final, most brutal weapon. He let his gaze sweep past the Duke and land, with deliberate, devastating cruelty, on Lydia. But if we are speaking of desperation and questionable integrity, perhaps we should address the integrity of your staff, Duke, Miles continued, his smile returning cold and razor-thin. It is rather convenient that a certain Miss Farnham has reappeared in your life precisely when you need a clerk with intimate knowledge of both your former vulnerabilities and a particular talent for, shall we say, creative accounting. Lydia froze by the fireplace, the crystal decanter in her hand suddenly weighing a ton. The murmur of conversation around the table died completely. All eyes turned to her. Miles advanced, 2 steps that brought him close enough to whisper, yet loud enough for the paralyzed guests to hear the venom in his voice. Don't look so frightened, Lydia. Did you truly think that after all we did, the Duke wouldn't eventually recognize the common clerk who signed her heart out for me? She is not a Miss Farnham, gentlemen. She is simply Lydia, a girl of the streets, an expert forger, and the direct cause of the Whitcomb scandal 4 years ago. She is a fraud, and her presence here is an act of calculated treason. He had done it. He had ripped the mask away, exposing her to the merciless judgment of the highest strata of society. The silence was agonizing, filled with the sudden, sharp intake of scandalized breath. The investors, men of profound social and financial rigidity, looked at Lydia with horrified contempt. Lydia's composure, maintained with such punishing effort for so many months, finally shattered. The room tilted. The years of fear, the burden of the guilt, the constant, exquisite tension of the Duke's scrutiny, all converged in a single, devastating moment. She dropped the decanter. It did not break, saved by the thickness of the rug, but the sound was deafening, a harsh public sign of her defeat. She looked at Miles, then at the horrified faces of the investors, and finally, she turned her gaze to Jonathan, her eyes burning with a desperate, self-condemning honesty. Her lips trembled. "It is true," she whispered, the words escaping in a painful gasp. She was confessing not to Miles, but to the man she had wronged. Not the scheme he claims now, but the first one, the first time. "I was the clerk. I did it, I signed the papers. I was foolish and terrified and desperate, and I ruined your name, your grace. I am not Miss Farnham. I am nobody." She was shaking violently, unable to stop the flow of broken truth. "I came here as penance. I swear. I never meant to." Before she could continue, before the words could fully solidify the ruin Miles desired, Jonathan Whitcomb moved. It was a movement of absolute, calculated power. He rose from the table, his chair scraping harshly back, the only other sound besides Lydia's gasping confession. He did not look at Miles. His eyes were fixed entirely on Lydia's pale, exposed face. He walked toward her, his approach slow, deliberate, and utterly commanding. He stopped just inches away, his towering frame overshadowing her collapse. The guests waited, breath held, for the inevitable, thunderous condemnation, the righteous fury of the betrayed Duke finally unleashing his vengeance. But Jonathan did not condemn her. He looked at the tears streaming down her face, the genuine, raw misery of her confession, and the memory of her passionate defense of the poor, her sharp memory saving his reputation, and the cold, diamond-hard resolve of his revenge melted, not into mercy, but into a strange, fierce act of possession. "Enough, Miss Farnham," Jonathan commanded, his voice deep, strong, and utterly unwavering. He lifted a hand, and with a gesture of shocking intimacy and finality, he placed it on her shoulder, a physical claim of ownership. He turned his gaze from Lydia's broken confession to Miles Carraway, his eyes now blazing with a cold, terrifying authority that silenced the entire room. "Mr. Carraway," Jonathan stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "allow me to correct your assumption." He squeezed Lydia's shoulder, a signal that was both support and a firm injunction to silence. "I have known the truth of Miss Farnham's origins and her history for weeks. Indeed, since the moment she was hired. I was simply waiting for you to reappear. The statement landed like a physical blow on Miles. It was a complete, unexpected reversal. The Duke had known all along? Jonathan continued, his voice heavy with the depth of his deliberate choice. Miss Farnham did, in a moment of utter personal desperation and under your most contemptible manipulation, sign the papers 4 years ago, a fact I verified upon discovering her identity shortly after her arrival. However, he paused, letting the silence draw tight. I am aware that she immediately fled your influence and did so with the expressed purpose of avoiding further complicity in your schemes. She came here, to my home, using a facade she created to survive. Jonathan's grip tightened on Lydia's shoulder, a silent message of shared exposure. He looked at Miles, his expression now one of profound, cold fury, but his words were for the benefit of his witnesses. I allowed her to stay, Jonathan declared, his voice dropping slightly, conveying a depth of righteous pain. I allowed her to stay, to work in my offices, to organize the very assets she helped you compromise, because I saw a woman consumed by genuine, debilitating shame and terror. The lie, the fear, the daily torture of expecting my discovery. That, Caraway, is a profound and endless form of penance. The fear you imposed on her is a greater punishment than any jail cell could offer. He looked back at the terrified investors, asserting his control over the narrative. Miss Farnham has spent her tenure here correcting the errors of the past. She has shown me nothing but flawless, unflinching dedication, saving me from genuine financial and political disaster multiple times. The shame she carries is punishment enough for a moment of youthful weakness. He turned back to Miles, his eyes now conveying a lethal contempt that promised utter ruin. Your lie, Caraway, is that you are motivated by justice. Your truth is that you are a financial opportunist, now seeking to leverage an innocent woman's past for a desperate new scheme. Miss Farnham refused your demands tonight. She chose loyalty over self-preservation, which is more integrity than you have ever displayed. Jonathan's voice rose, concluding the matter with absolute finality. You are now trespassing, Caraway. I suggest you remove yourself from my house and my property immediately. If you ever contact Miss Farnham again, or if you attempt to use this knowledge against her, I will not only ruin you financially, I will ensure your public and social destruction is total, comprehensive, and absolute. He looked down at Lydia, who was staring up at him, her confession halted, her past exposed, yet utterly protected. The cold mask was finally dropped, replaced by a deep, weary anger that acknowledged their shared wound. He had chosen. He had revealed his pain and his anger, but he had chosen to defend her, not condemn her. The debt of betrayal was now replaced by the terrible, complicated burden of his protection. The shame was still hers, but the decision and the consequences were now entirely his. The gilded cage had not broken. It had only sealed them both inside. The dismissal of Miles Caraway was not instantaneous, but a lingering surgical event. After Jonathan's final, cutting sentence, the room remained locked in a horrified silence. The investors, sensing the profound shift in power and the depth of the Duke's resolve, quickly rallied to their host's side. Miles, his grand scheme of leverage ruined, his reputation shredded by the Duke's cold, authoritative declaration, found himself suddenly isolated, treated by the once fawning guests as a social and professional pariah. Jonathan did not waste breath on further threats. He simply issued a series of quiet, devastating commands to Darius Holt, the chief steward, who materialized with chilling efficiency. Mr. Holt, ensure Mr. Caraway is immediately escorted from the premises. His accounts with the estate and with any associated firms are to be flagged for immediate and comprehensive audit. The solicitor will handle the formal severance of all peripheral professional ties by morning. I want him ruined, Mr. Holt. Completely. The efficiency of Caraway's ruin was total. He was swept from the manor, his protestations falling on deaf ears, his final venomous glare at Lydia a mark of his absolute, impotent hatred. The immediate public disaster had been averted, transformed by the Duke's narrative into a scene of noble benevolence and professional triumph over a known scoundrel. The dinner guests, reassured by the Duke's composure and his capacity to navigate and crush such threats, quickly departed, their initial shock replaced by a thrilling sense of shared secret and renewed respect for the Duke's unforgiving power. The saloon emptied, leaving only Lydia and Jonathan in the vast, echoing space. The discarded decanter still lay on the rug, a symbol of her shattered composure. The air was thick with the residue of confession, the bitter tang of fear, and the profound, terrible relief of being entirely, finally known. Lydia stood trembling, not with fear of what was to come, but with the exhaustion of the battle. She walked slowly toward the Duke's desk, her steps measured, every fiber of her being devoted to performing one last, definitive act of integrity. Jonathan watched her, not moving from the spot where he had defended her. His gaze intense, assessing, stripped of the pretense he had worn for months. He had exposed himself, too, revealing not just his knowledge, but the painful depth of his bitterness and the complexity of his choice. She stopped before the desk and bowed her head, not in a curtsy, but in a simple, earnest gesture of submission to the truth. "Your Grace," she began, her voice hoarse, but steady. "Miles's version was only partially true. You gave me the necessary lie to survive. But I cannot continue the deception. I owe you the entire truth without omission." She swallowed hard, forcing the words out, completing the confession she had begun in a moment of panic. She described her background, not a laundress, but the daughter of a ruined scholar, forced into low-level clerk work after his death. She confessed to the sheer desperation that made her vulnerable to Miles's seductive promises. She recounted the exact forgery, the amount she had taken. A pittance compared to the overall loss, but her moral absolute, and the fear that had driven her to hide the truth for 4 years. "You asked once about the handwriting, Your Grace. It was the same handwriting I used on those documents. The mirror you found in the desk drawer, it was mine. I kept it because it was the only thing I owned that wasn't borrowed or stolen. A piece of myself I couldn't bear to discard." She lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze with unyielding, raw honesty. "I knew you recognized the script. I suspected you knew the truth weeks ago, perhaps since the first week. I saw your silence as a protracted form of cruelty, a slow vengeance, and I accepted it as my due. It was the only way I could justify staying here, serving the man I had helped wound." She reached into her pocket and placed the letter of resignation on the mahogany surface. A plain piece of paper, signed with the simple, true name that was her own. Lydia. "I offer my resignation, Your Grace, not out of fear but out of final integrity. I understand that the exposure of my origins alone is enough to require my immediate departure, even without the felony that preceded it. I do not ask for clemency. I ask only that you accept my final act of honesty. You have saved me from Miles, and I am eternally grateful. But I must leave Whitcomb Manor and return to the life that is truly mine." She stood utterly still, waiting for the cold, absolute judgment she knew was inevitable. Her confession was complete. Her shame was public. All that remained was the Duke's word. Jonathan remained motionless for a long time, processing the sheer depth of her final honesty. She was confessing not to gain favor, but to earn the right to self-respect. She was offering to sacrifice the comfortable illusion of Miss Farnham for the crushing reality of Lydia, the common clerk. He slowly walked around the desk, stopping before her. He did not touch the resignation letter. "I refuse to accept it, Lydia," he stated, using her real name for the first time with a weight that was profound and devastating. "You will not leave this house." His gaze was intense, analytical, yet tinged with a deep, weary acknowledgement. "You mistake my motives, or perhaps you simplify them. My silence was not merely protracted cruelty, though I will admit that initial impulse was strong. My initial plan, after confirming your identity through that damnable handwriting, was precisely the ruin Miles attempted, but slow, meticulous, and administered by my own hand. He leaned closer, his voice dropping, sharing the intimate geography of his own bitterness. I allowed you to stay because you were a tangible object of my vengeance. You were proof that I was right to distrust everyone, that I was right to hate the world that mocked my misfortune. Your presence here, living under the shadow of my discovery, fed the anger and the coldness I have relied on since Caraway's scheme crippled my public trust. He paused, a flicker of true, raw pain crossing his aristocratic features. But then you started working. You cataloged my chaos. You preempted my errors. You saw the regulatory change I missed, saving me from a scandal more damaging than the first. You spoke with a passion I haven't heard in years, defending the dignity of the very class you fled. You risked your ruin to deny Miles Caraway tonight. And in doing so, you forced me to confront a terrible truth. You are a thief and a fraud, yes, but you are also the only person I have employed in a decade who is both competent and utterly honest in their work. He stood back, gesturing to the resignation letter on the desk. You see this letter, signed Lydia? It is your final act of courage and integrity. It is an act of genuine repentance, done without coercion. That integrity, earned over these last weeks, is a far more valuable asset to me than the fictional title of Miss Farnham. He walked to the window, staring out at the impenetrable darkness of the grounds. I have carried my bitterness like a shield, Lydia, refusing to trust, refusing to forgive, letting the memory of your betrayal poison every action. In choosing to condemn Caraway and defend you tonight, I chose to finally put that poison aside. You committed a crime against my assets, but I was preparing a far greater crime against your life and spirit. He turned back, offering not absolution, but a terrible shared burden. We are both products of necessary deceits and profound bitterness. I need your mind. I need your competence. And perhaps, I need the relentless honesty that your shame imposes upon you. I will not have you leave this house, only to be chased by the next version of Caraway, only to be forced to lie again. Jonathan extended his hand, not a lover's gesture, but a professional pact, a rigid offer of a truce on a field of war. The lie is dead, he declared. Miss Farnham is gone. You are Lydia. You will stay here as my principal administrator. Your past is known only to me and to Darius Holt, who is discreet. Your future will be built on work, competence, and a recognition of the difficult, precarious truth between us. There will be no titles, no social pretense, only the work and the silence. It will not be easy, and it will not be safe, but it will be honest. Do you accept the terms of this employment? Lydia looked at the extended hand, the clean, powerful lines of his palm, the visible sign of a commitment that was frightening in its honesty. He was offering her a future built not on her lie, but on her failure and subsequent redemption. He was offering her a second chance, earned not through his mercy, but through her competence and final integrity. It was a perilous contract, a partnership based on mutual recognition of past darkness, but it was real. She took a slow, deep breath, finally letting go of the crippling tension that had defined her life. She looked at the strong, cold man before her, the man who had the power to crush her and yet chose to protect her. She placed her own trembling, common hand into his. I accept your grace, she whispered, sealing the contract of their shared, complicated future. The old chapter was closed, not with forgiveness, but with a terrifying, absolute truth that was the foundation of everything to come. The work began now. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.